Welcome everybody to this live stream for painting Legends of Kalidasia miniatures. I'm Jason, the creator of the Kalidasia universe, and I got a few minutes late start there for a couple different reasons, blah 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 details, but you know, I'm here to continue this process of painting the Heragul Hammerhead here in a very detailed, very attentive way. That sounds pretty good. So I'm going to continue that tonight for about an hour, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about approaching how not to retcon your sci-fi universe. Because I changed some things up here in 2nd edition, but I didn't actually retcon anything. I'll explain why. It's very interesting. But I've also got one thing to show off here in just a moment. For those of you who don't follow me on Instagram, over at Kalidasia Games, I've got the greens for a new miniature here that's going to be coming out not too far in the future. So let's start there with looking at that. Let me slide my other camera up here. Oh, look, it's a hammerhead. Nope, I got the little miniature pieces here in just a moment as I kick my camera as I sit down. Here we go. We're going to start with this guy right here. Of course, that's not a new miniature. That is the Heragul Lynx Battle Cruiser. It's about 7 years old. But what is new is the upgrade kit for it. So I've got a few pieces here to show off. Because like I said, this miniature haul is about 7 years, a little less than 7 years old. I think it was October or November of 2010 that the first batch of miniatures came out. And this is actually I don't know if this is one of the original castings or not. I had 2 production runs of Kalidasia. Sorry, I keep kicking my camera. I'm off to a wonderful start, aren't I? So I don't remember if this was the original production run or not. I had two, like I said, I had 2 production runs of the Kalidasia miniatures, and I don't remember which one was which. But anyway, so for those of you who have purchased Legends of Kalidasia Heroes of the Heragul, you'll notice the Lynx token does have some extra pieces added to it. Because this figure was designed a while ago. It was designed last year sometime, but I never got around to getting it into production mode because I had the frigates that I've been painting up as well as the 2 destroyers. But you would see in the token art for Heroes of the Heragul, there's some new stuff added on there, and in fact the final miniature is even newer than what's in the token artwork. But primarily I have this giant command deck here, some engine cooling things in the back. Along the bottom of the warship you're going to have some matching engine cooling pieces just like that. And those kind of are the bottom versions of what you see here on the top of the ships. This one actually would go on that side. This one would go on this one. And they're going to go on the bottom where these engine cooling pieces are. Another bottom piece is just more cooling fins and things like that. Some weird, I don't know, weird random thing in the little opening on the bottom here because it looks cool. So that's going to go on the very bottom of the ship, and that's where you're going to attach the flight peg now. It's going to go in between one of these cooling vents. Just like on the Heragul Hammerhead and some of the Surikari warships, where they don't actually need a little hole in the miniature for the flight peg, because frankly those are kind of annoying to cast. And this allows you to get around that by having these cooling vents. Then I've got these side pieces, so the command deck also wraps around the side of the miniature, and then it's a little bit tough to get them to stay in place, but these side pieces will go on here and kind of glue to the side of the Heragul warship. There's one for that side, one for this side, and that's going to be just more like cooling, more armor vents, things like that to apply to the Heragul Lynx. And then finally we've got all the weapon systems. So we have the base of the turret gun that's going to go here. We're getting rid of the 3 little fire rails, and I'll talk more about that retconning stuff in a little bit here as it pertains to fire rails. And I've brought over the design from the Heragul Pale Fox, which has those really huge things, huge fire rails mounted on the bottom of the hull. Those have been brought over. Here's the big turret one that's going to go in the top here. Then I have the side ones that are a little bit smaller because the idea is they're kind of built into more to the hull of the warship. And these guys are going to both go along here to give it its large forward fire rails. In theory, they extend further in to the warship than what you see. And these are just kind of the tips of the weapons here. So altogether, that's what you're looking at for the new Heragul Lynx Battle Cruiser. I'm thinking I'll start resin casting these things pretty soon, maybe this weekend, and I'm sure I'll be doing some of this live streaming where I do resin casting. I've done that before. You can actually find a nice hour-and-a-half long super detailed resin casting tutorial for spaceships on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Kalidasia Games, or maybe /users Kalidasia Games. Either way, it is a really great, very detailed tutorial how to cast things like this, but I'm sure I'll do some more live streaming of it. And once I get this into production, let's say end of May, you might see this guy available for sale. Initially, it's going to be both the upgrade kit by itself for those of you who have just the original haul, and also the current Heragul battle cruiser miniature will be basically deprecated and taken off the market and replaced with the complete kit. Alright, well that is it for our little miniature showcase here. Later on in the year, I'm definitely going to go and show you the whole build design process of tabletop miniatures from start to finish. But for now, I was just showing off what's coming out here for Legends of Kalidasia in the next few weeks or so. And we're going to dive back in to painting the Heragul Hammerhead that we've been working on now for about 2 weeks. I've done a little bit of work off camera where I experiment a little bit with highlighting the brown edges. Let's see if you can really, if I bring it up close, can you see that pretty well? There, a little bit, yeah. You can tell there's a little bit of color differential here between the tips of these two armor panels and what's back here. That's what I've been working on. I'm just doing some very subtle layering and highlighting like that. And if I did things right with my wet palette here, it looks like those shades of brown and orange are still there. And how I've created these highlights is I've started with oak brown, which that's the base color of the brown color you see here all over the Heragul Hammerhead. It's what I spent all of last time very slowly painting up. And to highlighting it, I'm using Troll Slayer Orange from the Citadel Layer paint line. And I use orange instead of white because orange and brown are very similar hues. So it brightens up the brown without desaturating the color. And that's why I like to do that. So I'm going to continue the same process like I showed you just a moment ago here with oak brown mixed in with some various amounts of the Troll Slayer Orange to get a lighter brown color. I'm working with my Artificial Layers Citadel brush. This is a very high quality, similar to the Winsor Newton Series 7 brushes. To give you an idea, it's a very expensive, high quality brush. And all I do to highlight these things is I take a very small amount of paint on the brush. So I'm not dry brushing. I'm just dipping the brush in the paint, just the tip of it, just like that. So very small amounts of paint going on it. And I'm just working from the edge of the armor panel backwards. And I'm doing this again and again and again. And even once the brush runs out of paint, I keep sweeping backwards. Because what that does is that is slowly spreading out the little bit of paint that I applied. Then I go back in, get a tiny bit more paint on my brush, and we do that process again. And you know, after about a half a dozen passes, you're going to start to see a noticeable increase. Increase in the brightness of the tip of this armor panel. And then I'm going to use some shade to get even more contrast, because then your eye is going to see the contrast, and your eye interprets the contrast as detail and depth and things like that. But we'll deal with that in a little bit. Alright, so retconning and how I approach things is second edition of Legends of Kalidasia. Because retconning, I don't know if it actually stands for something, but what it essentially is referring to is that you're making changes to the history of your science fiction universe. And this happens for various reasons throughout any franchise that's ran for a long period of time. It's sometimes just to open up new story possibilities. Maybe it's a way that the whoever the creator can go back in and sell more stuff, or make it so that there's more variety in the current storyline, or they've had a new, cooler idea about how the story is playing out, and they want to, you know, go experiment with that. But it generally just happens from time to time, and just kind of like, well, deal with it. And there's various ways that gaming companies have dealt with it before. You've got Disney with the Star Wars franchise kind of went in and more or less got rid of a lot of the back fiction of Star Wars from what I understand. So I think there's, you know, a lot of the books were removed. Halo Their franchise more or less went in and said the video games are canon, the books are not. And that happened with, like, when Halo Reach came out, because that changed some of the backstory to the Halo universe. Let's see. Warhammer 40,000 infamously basically declares it is propaganda. Whether it's pro-Imperium propaganda or pro-Xenos propaganda, it doesn't really matter. It's, hey, you know, that story was factually incorrect because you are reading propaganda, not the actual truth. Of course, you know, given the universe, that the actual, quote, blessed truth may be propaganda itself, and it probably is propaganda. But I've set the goal of trying not to retcon things. Technically, I already have. For those of you who have found that YouTube video that introduced Kalidasia to the world, it's not in Kalidasia games. Keep looking. I think the name Kalidasia only shows up at the very end, but you can kind of figure out, oh, it's like, huh, those things look kind of familiar to stuff I've seen in Legends of Kalidasia. I've already kind of retconned a few things in that regard, but for the main storyline when it comes to the actual Legends of Kalidasia proper story, because that video reference is not part of the Legends of Kalidasia story. It was part of the Kalidasia universe, but not the Legends story. Legends being the ancient war between the Heragul and Surkari, for those who are wondering what I'm referring to when I talk about that. But there are a number of things that are kind of new with the release of 2nd edition and the release of the new miniatures. And I was trying to think, and I wanted to think about how can I go about introducing these new things in the storyline without just pretending like, oh, well, they existed all along and what came before never existed. Because I don't really want to do that, right? And I'm getting an example right in front of you here with this Heragul Hammerhead. This Hammerhead design you see here, it definitely looks like the original Hammerhead. Let me go, is there one sitting around here? There's not. But it looks like the original Hammerhead. It's got the basic shape of it, the same weapons, same color scheme, same approximate positioning of some of the colors. But overall, it's a very different look to it. It's not simply a more detailed version of the old one. It's a new look, new engine style. The engine style is different. Things are a little bit different sizes. A lot more armor panels. It's got some cooling vents back here that are not part of the original one. So there I ran into the question, like, how do I integrate this new thing into the story without simply saying, oh, well, the old stuff was never there? Because all the old artwork still has, you know, the original Hammerhead design. And I'm thinking, at some point in the not distant future, you're going to see the original Hammerhead design come back out in a higher detailed miniature. I really want to do that. And just have some alternate variations, and so you can decide what fleet type do you want. Do you want this view of the Hammerhead, or do you want the original looking Hammerhead? So you get some choices and some variety in how you build your fleet. So I kind of dove in a little bit to my very small amount of experience with military defense contract work. I've spent like 7 months-ish working for a private military defense contractor, and there's just a lot of, you'll find it, you know, it's not even anything really unique to that industry, to be honest with you. It's kind of with everything. There's a lot of rivalries in businesses, and any kind of contracting world, there's a lot of rivalries going on. There's the fact that there can be government versus private in anything. You know, you can even see that. I'm a big weather fan. There's a bit of a rivalry between the National Weather Service of the United States and private companies like AccuWeather, just because it's the nature of how things work. When there's two different groups trying to do very similar things, there's bound to be people who like one more over the other, and those kind of things. And I kind of use that to play into why there's this new frigate all of a sudden, this new Hammerhead frigate, as well as Mackerel frigate. Because the storyline goes is that what this ship is you see in front of you here was built on top of the original basic structure of the original basic structure of the frigate, but they made a whole variety of improvements to address what are more or less known issues with the frigate, but there never was really the political will to deal with them. So, for example, storyline-wise, the original Hammerhead and Mackerels had a tendency to have their engines overheat in prolonged combat. You're talking combat that's generally longer than you ever really saw in a Legends of Kalidasia game, but it's something that could possibly happen when the Surikari use their type of attacks, where they just launch wave after wave of ships into, the fleets. So that's part of the idea of why the engines look different. It's because these engines have been redesigned with better cooling in mind. Because, long story short, cooling is actually very hard in space. It does seem very counterintuitive because you think of space being very, very cold, and it is. But cooling is really facilitated by having some sort of medium to carry the heat away. Space is a vacuum. There is nothing there to carry the heat away very fast. So it radiates very slowly, and if you're stuck in the bright sunlight, you're not cooling off very well. So that was like kind of a story, how that comes in the whole rivalry thing is that this particular frigate is actually built and designed by the Heragul military. This is the government's work. Wait, is this the government's work? Yes, this is the government's work. Wait. I don't know my own story on the top of my head. That's embarrassing. It's the Elsoran shipyards. The Elsoran shipyards are run by the Heragul Navy. It is the Calderan shipyards, which is part of the Albion Prefecture. So for those of you who have been following along with the Albion campaign, which, by the way, since the story will probably go up when I'm done here and the video's already out, Heragul Empire got a minor victory in Albion 8. And you finally, when I post the story here after this thing, get to figure out exactly what's going on with Operation Octavius. But more about that later. I need a little bit more orange down on my palette. So anyway, the Elsoran shipyards are the ones in this case that are run by the Heragul Navy. The Calderan ones are basically the private military contractors who built a lot, not necessarily built a lot of the Hammerhead frigates, but in some ways, they were off doing their own thing, and whereas the military guys, you kind of wanting to get a little bit of comeuppance with them, went ahead and redesigned a lot of the ships and just had the government push these design changes through, foregoing contracts, blah blah blah, weird stuff like that. Surikar, you're invading. There's a lot of the Surikar invasion was kind of used as justifications how to push things through, and I'm kind of playing up a little rivalry there. That's always government versus private contract, and that's across lots of industries. You have UPS versus FedEx versus the USPS. People seem to really get uptight about that one. I don't know why. It's shipping. I mean, granted, as someone who obviously sells stuff online, I have my preferred shipping carriers, but that's just the nature of what it really. But it really depends on what your business case is, But people get uptight about that kind of stuff. But that's the whole point, right? There's always these rivalries in any industry, and that's how I found a way to introduce a new miniature. It's basically, there's a rivalry inspired the design, but so the other one's still there. The old Hammerhead frigate is still there. It's still available for sale if you want to purchase that. And like I said, at some point in the not too distant future, and by that I mean probably next year, you're going to see like a newer, updated version of it that it still looks like very much like the original one, but more detailed, just kind of more modern detail level for gamers that have one that's 7 years old, that kind of a thing. That's an example of how I was able to introduce an entirely new miniature into the storyline that looks totally different without having to consider it a retcon. So the old Hammerhead still there, still hangs around, still shows up in artwork every now and then, though to be honest with you, the Elsoran shows up in a lot of the new stuff because it's just cooler. But the old, every now and then you're still going to see the old Heragul Hammerhead artwork, because the Elsoran is still not everywhere. There's still primarily the thousands of frigates that exist in the Heragul Navy are going to be the original Hammerheads. And another example of how I approach the same kind of a thing, but this time we have a story of the Fire Rail. So for those of you who have played Legends of Kalidasia for a long time, would know that the big ship, or the big weapon that a lot of the Heragul ships carried used to be called the Fire Torpedo. This is what the Pale Fox carried, and the Battlecruiser carried. It's not the biggest weapon the Heragul have. The biggest weapon they have is called the Fire Catapult, which shows up only on this guy here, the Battleship, which was a miniature that's never been formally released yet. This was, I don't know, this guy here is probably about 6 years old, this model. I'd bring them out at some of the local conventions that people could play with them, but these giant things appear with the Fire Catapults. However, with 2nd edition, I renamed the Fire Torpedo to the Fire Rail, and this is actually a very practical reason as to why I did this. Going way back to the development of 1st edition, when the rules are being written, like it was actually about 7 years ago was when I was doing the major rule writing for 1st edition of Kalidasia, is when I introduced the Fire Cannon and the Fire Torpedo. Those are the first 2 weapons the Heragul had aboard their ships, and it was then finally there's the Arc Cannon was the 3rd weapon. The idea of the Javelin missile hadn't been created yet. So for those of you who are not familiar with Legends of Kalidasia, the Fire Cannon and Fire Torpedo are direct fire weapons. You roll a dice to see if they hit. The Javelin missile has a bit of a token system to it where it flies around the board, locks on to guys, and does damage that way. Now, it was a bit of confusing to players when they were like, well, the Fire Torpedo, a torpedo seems kind of like a missile, so why does the torpedo work like a gun and not like a missile? And it really was simply because the rules for missiles, like Javelin missile, Plasma missile, Antimatter missile, what the Coith Guard have, those things, whatever, they came, a few weeks later after the Fire Torpedo was created. And it kind of gave some weird story reasons to why the Fire Torpedo worked more like a gun than a missile. But in the end, when 2nd edition rolled around, I'm like, well, let's just go ahead and change the name of this weapon. But then how do I make it so it's not a retcon? So I don't want to retcon it, but I want to give it a name that doesn't imply that it should work like a missile, hence the Fire Rail, because the Fire Rail is sort of a railgun type weapon, sort of, because the Heragul Empire aren't great at that. The Thalix are. Hence why the Fire Catapult is a true railgun, and that's why it's so freaking huge. Because the Heragul are just not that great at that kind of electrical circuitry to generate that kind of electricity. But so how do you go ahead and make it so that's not really a retcon? The answer was, well, I was kind of lucky in this case because the entire 1st edition story for Legends of Kalidasia really took place in one area of the Heragul Empire. It was the very corner of the Sarlat district. And what I can do in that case is, well, you know what Fire Torpedo was? It's merely a regional dialect, like a regional local terminology they would use to apply to the Fire Catapult or the Fire Rail. The Fire Rail is the official proper name, but these guys in this part of the particular area of the Empire, for whatever reason, would always call it a Fire Torpedo. Bam. That's being clever there, if I do say so myself. It's like, well, that's okay. So that's kind of that's my little clever way there how I can rename the weapon. But you know what? It still can be the same thing because it's just they just call it different in this part of the Empire because that's just how people are. There's a whole famous thing in the United States here: pop versus soda pop. Pop's the right answer, no questions asked. Soda's wrong, completely wrong, never, ever, ever. But that's how it works. Different regions will have of a country or a language speaking area will use different words for the same thing. So I applied that line of thinking to how I could justify renaming the Fire Torpedo to the Fire Rail, and therefore avoid all that confusion of, well, why does a torpedo not work like a missile? So those are a few examples of how you can try to more or less avoid retconning. And a lot of that comes from, I mean, like the second one, for example, is a little bit of luck, because the storyline just didn't advance very far because I wasn't able to spend as much time as I wanted to developing the storyline of Kalidasia during the first edition days. So that's part of the reason why I was able to region lock things like that. But I think your overall goal when you're in the early phases of writing some kind of like sci-fi story like this is the less you tell, the easier it is to integrate future stuff into your story. The more things you try to tell early on, the more gotchas you have to work around. And that's definitely something that I have carried over. It's really like an individual storytelling method of how you don't overload your people who are reading your story. So I for the longest time when I did video work, I had this tendency to cram as much story stuff as I could in short videos, and basically no one could follow what was going on because there was so much stuff in there. Well, okay, I could follow along what's going on. That doesn't work, right? You gotta be able to tell the story. That eventually, I had some friends helping me out when I initially wrote the short story that became Silex Road and blossomed into Secrets of Silex and Heroes of Armageddon. But they're basically like, you're trying to cram too much stuff in a short story. And even in a single short story which only evolves around a few events, or even a novel, that still line of thinking applies to world building. If you don't need to include a justification for something right away, don't worry about it. If it's not important to the immediate story, it can just be there and let people think about that. As an example of how I've kind of added those things in over the years, if you go back to Silex Road, you have a character in there who in the first short story simply introduced as Delta Leader, which is his call sign. He's the head of the Delta Fire Team under Abby Cyan's command, and he never gets a name. And in the second story and throughout Secrets of Silex, he's continued just to refer to as Delta Leader, and even into Heroes of Armageddon, he still is called Delta Leader. You don't use his real name. Partially, this is a valid for purposes of telling who is who, because there was already so many Heraguls running around. We had 2 Sargentics, Abby Cyan and Sen Kylon, and a few other, like Captain V.K. Len, Arkylon. So there's already a few other Heragul characters lying around, so having somebody with a radically different name structure help keep them straight. And there's also the thing how there was 2 Kylon family members, Sen Kylon, Arkylon, and they didn't know each other. They're like, I don't know who this guy is, right? So I had to explain a couple things here in the sense of how do you explain that you have 2 members of the same family who have no idea who each other is, and you have this guy who refuses to, for whatever reason, use his actual name. And these things combined to add a whole factor of culture to the Heragul Empire. As I explained in Heroes of the Armageddon, the reason why Delta Leader doesn't use his real name is because in the Empire, your name means a lot about who you are and who you are expected to be. So right then and there, I've used this character I created and something that's about him that's just odd to introduce a very interesting aspect of the culture of the Heragul Empire, in the sense that we don't know why he doesn't use his name, but now we know why. Because for some reason, I never say why, he doesn't feel that he can live up to this name. This could be an issue with him in terms of his short-sightedness. This could be something he does not agree with the political views of his particular family name in the Heragul Empire. That's very important. I'll dive into that in just a moment. What I'm doing now is I need to clean up a lot of the brown painted areas. Whoop, that's not on camera. That's more on camera. Because there's just the nature of how I painted the brown areas, there's a little bit of sloppiness around them. So what I'm going to do is take a very small amount of the desert yellow on my brush. This is the yellow color that's all over the miniature right now. And I'm going to use very small amounts of that and just kind of go around the edges of the brown areas and clean them up and give them nice, clean, straight lines. So just like what I did a moment ago here with all the orange and brown mixture, I'm going to dive in to the desert yellow and just get a tiny amount on the edge of my brush. And maybe even a little bit too much. And just do a lot of quick little strokes around these brown areas to give them nice, clean, straight lines. So Delta Leader, like I said, maybe he doesn't agree with how his family wants to live his life. Maybe he's chosen to be a career soldier, and his family, maybe are pacifist. You never really know why, but we now understand a whole bunch about Heragul culture because of the fact that this guy doesn't use his real name. And this is an example of, I've been rambling, aren't I? Sorry. But this was an example of how I had to basically uniquely merge some weird fact about a guy and a major part of the storyline. And if I had said too much stuff from the get-go, I wouldn't have been able to come up with something interesting. Now, how that ties in then to the Kylon family is now I've got a precedent that your family name means something from what you're expected to support politically. And the Kylon family has some very strong, very unique political views in the context of the Heragul Empire. And you can read more about that in your Heroes of the Heragul rulebook. So that's how that thing affected the whole naming and political views and stuff like that of the various characters. And then when we get into the whole thing about how, well, we have these two Kylon family members that don't know each other, how do I explain that? That helped to drive the culture of the Heragul Empire surrounding marriage and family. And that, I think I mentioned this a while ago, it's also, once again, in the Heroes of the Heragul rulebook, that in the Heragul Empire, when two people get married, they adopt the family name, they generally adopt the family name of the most prestigious family. So therefore, it's very easy for families to grow very large, and by growing very large, you're going to have people who share your name, but you have never ever seen them in life, because they could just kind of jump around, and over the course of a couple of generations, you could easily double your family every generation if you're a big prestigious name, i.e. like the Kylons. So that's an example of how you can very carefully, by not revealing a lot of stuff up front, you can avoid retconning things later. And then, because by not revealing a lot of stuff up front, it lets you think about things. When crafting a huge world, like I've done with Legends of Kalidasia, it's very helpful to be able to just think about things for a while before you formally announce them. I've shown off a few times my epic binder, my codex as I like to call it, even though I'm fairly sure, I don't know if GW has a term codex trademark, but it's not a product I sell. But anyway, it's just my massive collection of Kalidasia history and things like that, and it contains plenty of unreleased information. And I'm making these notes months ahead of when I plan, months, even sometimes years. I think there's some stuff in there that may not be revealed for several years still. And it gives me plenty of time to sit down and think about these things and decide if, well, do I really need to reveal them now? Because if I don't have to reveal them right now, I have more time to think about if I really want to include this fact or this statement of truth into the game. And if the less of that stuff I introduced earlier, as I just mentioned, the easier it's going to be later on to not have to go back and change stuff and avoid changing things. And then the other thing about how to avoid retconning is something I'm very interested in, which is information organization. And this is also part of the reason why I have this giant binder of information. Is in order to avoid having to retcon things, you not only have to be able to plan stuff out, but you got to be able to make this information accessible in a way that makes sense. So having this binder has really been also been an exercise in how do I store a ever-evolving galactic amount of information, because that's technically an accurate title. You're basically telling the story of a portion of a galaxy. How do I organize this information in a way that makes it easy to find what I need when I need it? And it's been a fun exercise for me to try to figure this out. And there's some interesting things that I've taken. Like, for example, one of the things that I've started doing is that every major character in this binder effectively has a timeline, saying where they are at certain times relative to the storyline. Milan Holter is the first one I've worked on. Milan Holter is one of the Kolaith Guard Marines who shows up in Heroes of Armageddon, and I've kind of planned out where he is for the next few months, and I've recorded where he was in the few months leading up to Heroes of Armageddon. So therefore, as he shows up later in the storyline, he's going to come back. The next series of online stories, whenever they're released, he shows up once or twice in that. And then a little bit further along in the storyline, he plays another very major role in things before he just kind of, whatever. I'm not sure what happens to him after that. But this way I know where he is at various points, and it's easy for me to then find this information because it's attached to Milan Holter's record. It's not hidden somewhere in the timeline, because I'd be thinking, and this lets me easily see, well, if I write a new story with him later on, does it make sense that this flows with, where he's been, and what has happened to him, and all this kind of stuff. And it's positioned, like I said, in such a way that it's easy to find. Because if you think about it, the timeline is attached to Milan Holter's entry. Now, why is that important? Is because the information you really want to know is where is Milan Holter been at any given time. That's really what the information you want to know for this kind of a thing. And that's step one when organizing information, is figuring out what is the information you actually are trying to know. It's very easily to just start cramming stuff various places without even thinking about that question, and that's a very bad way to approach things. So that was the first thing I had to approach, is what is the information that I really want to know, and if I don't know what the question is I'm asking, I can't formulate my data for an answer. And I finally thought about it for a while, and it was, if I'm going to write a story, I need to have my characters, and I need to know where the characters are at these various times in the story to see if they can even be where they're supposed to be. So that's how I came to the conclusion that the question I want to ask is, where is Milan Holter or Atlantic Highland or Abby Cyan, whoever it may be, at any given point? Because that's the question. And you could think of the answer being, well, I have a timeline of events in chronological order, and I could write down who was at each of those events. But that's not a bad thing to do, but that doesn't really help per se, because I think first of all, it becomes difficult as you start adding in pieces of information kind of in the past. So you're not always, when you write a story like this, you're not always adding information in chronological order. The Exterion fleets in the introduction of Kolaith Guard was a complete backstep. It wasn't a retcon, but it was going back in the timeline before the Surikar invaded and filling in details that way. So I think that the assumption that in your binder where everything's always going to be in chronological order is false. So you may not be able to easily find where somebody is, and it's quite possible that a character simply may just drop off the timeline for a few months. Where was Milan Holter before his arrival at Armageddon and Silex 4? It doesn't really matter. It's not recorded anywhere. So just because his absence from other events before that, and the other events don't always occur in the same place. So when you have something like, for example, the Battle of Verlanda and the encounter at Barnes Sekar, which are two events that occurred, I think, approximately the same time. I gotta look up the exact details, but they're approximately the same time, about 3-4 months post the Surikari invasion. You get in a situation where, if I look in the Battle of Verlanda, oh, okay, Mulan Holder's obviously not there because that was Surikari versus Heragul, and I have to then look. That doesn't mean that he's not somewhere else, right? You would have to look then. Okay, well, let's also check the Baron Sekar because that was also on the same timeline to know whether he was actually busy or not. It's that type of information, organized information that way, where it's organized around events. I guess my point that I'm getting to with this rambling is that that's not how you would organize the information to answer your question. When your question really is, where was this character at this time? And that it makes much more sense to answer that question in a format to where it's based around the character. And that's why I eventually came to the decision, what I'm going to do is each character is going to have their own personal timeline that says, okay, at 0 months, because the Kalidasia timeline is all based around the beginning of the Surikari invasion. So 0 days, 0 months, 0 seconds is the moment that the Quartek 6 was attacked. So at any given major character page, it's going to be 0 months, where were they? And then I'll have time ranges depending on, you know, what makes sense for the particular character. For Mulan Holder, he doesn't really show up until about 4 months into the storyline with Silex. So from 0 to 4 months, well, really minus 2 months because of the events of Exterion fleets. But so then 0 to 4 months, who knows where he is? It's not relevant where he is, so that space is open. Then from about 4 to 6 months ish, he's here on Silex, or 4 to 5 months, whatever it is, and then maybe at like 7 months after the whole situation of Silex is done, he's over here. And it's going to let you very quickly answer the question, well, where is Mulan Holter at this time? And what was the timeline of his events? And also, it's going to make more sense then and let you record minor events. Because maybe Mulan Holter, at a certain time point, is partaking in some very minor event that may be important to him as a character, some decision he makes, but isn't necessarily important to the overall story of the Kalidasia universe. So that's another advantage by having these personal timelines, is it lets you keeps track of that kind of things. Events that aren't super important in history, but they're important to character development. And that was a very long-winded answer as to why I'm structuring data, but when it comes to structuring data like this and avoiding retcons, it's important to really think about why you're structuring data and be able to be flexible about how you're structuring that. I like the idea that there's a personal timeline, and it also applies to planets too, knowing what faction controlled what planet at what time, what was its status at any given time. You require the same kind of a thing. Just because a planet was invaded by the Surikari at 4 months, it doesn't necessarily mean that that planet was immediately destroyed. Maybe it took 2 months to be captured. Maybe after it was not captured, but it was decimated and not really an effective planet. So there's a lot more to that history of the planet, same kind of thing, that would not necessarily be recorded in an immediate major battle. And therefore, by having a planetary timeline for each planet, it's the same kind of a thing. So the goal is to basically have a very flexible data structure that lets you move things around that can answer the questions you need to answer. And it's surprisingly difficult to do. Project management is an incredibly difficult thing to do because it involves not only negotiations, but human communication, human behavior understanding, and a lot of people don't realize that, I think, sometimes. They don't quite grasp the difficulties that are involved there, and because of that, they can't really develop effective ways to solve problems, and then there's not... Anyway, I'm really rambling now. Alright, well, let's talk more about painting. I've cleaned up a lot of the brown edges, and now I want to go through and use some shades to bring out some of these armor panels. And depending on what color I'm putting the shades on is going to be a different color of shade. So for these brown areas here, I'm going to be working with the non-oil gloss from Citadel's shade line. I love this particular paint. I use it all the time. It does two things. It makes things darker, but by being a gloss, it still makes it glow. It still gives it a little bit of metallic glow. Now with any of these shades, it's very important to only use as little as possible. So let me bring this guy in camera here. And you can see here with GW's paints, you've always got this little lip that has some paint on it. With this gloss, what you want to do is dip your brush into it, and then along the side of this lip, run it a little bit. And what that does, that gets rid of a lot of the gloss and lets it drip back down. You can always add more shade to a miniature, but you can't take shade away. This is very important. So what I'm going to do now is, if I hold this guy up here at a little bit of an angle, you can see that on this the nose piece here, there's a couple of layers of armor panels. Let's get you back in focus. Come on, get back in focus wherever you're at. And you kind of still see a little bit. There's a little bit of there's multiple armor panels there. And I want to accentuate those armor panels by adding contrast. So by running a very small amount of the shade along the base of those armor panels where they're raised up, you're going to create a bit of a shadow effect at their bottom, and that's going to create a dark area which will contrast versus the slightly lighter areas that you just painted there. And it's going to let your eye pick out that detail even more than it normally would on such a tiny miniature. Let me see now, if I hold this back up, you're going to see that there's a darker line there at the base of that armor panel, and it's going to let you pick out that armor piece with your eye a lot better. And you know, this is simply a effect that you can apply as much as you want. You know, and it's up to you just how much you want to, like I said, you want to apply. More is more contrast, but it's also going to look a little bit less natural. So it's a little bit of a finicky balance you got to play with. And whatever you like to do is whatever style you're going to go for, and it's totally up to you. And same line of thinking then, along this area here with these brown armor panels, there's a lot of little raised doodads here, like, you know, on this main piece that sits right here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 raised armor panels, same thing. Take a small amount of shade, run it along the base of these raised pieces, and that's going to let your eye pick out the contrast a bit more, and you're going to see that detail and make it stand out just a tiny bit more. I'll run some of the shade along the base of these two armor panels up here. Same thing along their sides, and it's just all about creating contrast, because contrast, like, is what your brain, one of the things your brain can use to enhance detail in areas. There we go. So I put a little bit of the shade in between the armor panels in front of some of them, and you got a lot more contrast up here. You can now actually see on camera where those 4 raised armor panels are. You probably couldn't see that very well a minute ago. And I'm going to do the same thing over here with these armor panels on the side. So still some raised armor pieces right here. Just apply a little bit of gloss or of the shade to them. Not too much. Like I said, it's a very fine balance. It's not easy to pull off. I probably apply a little bit too much to some of these areas, but that's alright. Just enough to create some contrast. Alright, so we got a little bit more contrast along those side pieces there. And finally, for this tonight, for this part, I'm going to do the same kind of thing right along here. There's 4 little raised pieces, 2 here, 2 there. A small amount of this gloss go in between them. And that's going to help, help your eyes pick out that detail. A little bit right, a little bit along there. So let's go in here, so a little bit along that side, a little bit along that side. So I'm putting just I'm not filling in the entire little cavity there. Just putting a little bit along the base of one of the detail pieces, a little bit along the base of the other one, leaving a little bit of the paint in the middle untouched, and then just small amounts there and there. And it's all about just giving your eyes a little bit something more to see detail. You can kind of see already right there, those little armor panels now standing out a lot more, just that little bit of extra contrast to them. And there's about 4 or 5 more areas like that on the brown panels you can deal with. For the beige sections, we're going to do the same kind of a thing, but I'm not going to be using the non-oil gloss. It's a little bit too much of a contrast there. Instead, I'm going to work with very small amounts of the Seraphim Sepia. So it's going to give it a little bit of a darker shade color, but it's not going to be quite as jarring as using the non-oil gloss. So same idea. Let me bring this guy back over here. Take a small amount of the shade on your brush, wipe a lot of it off on the side of the lip here. Take a little bit better shot there. Take some of the shade onto your brush, wipe it off on the side of the lip here, so that way you get rid of most of that shade, because once again, same thing, it's a shade. You can always apply more shade, you can't take it away. And very carefully along any of the beige areas, that's a little too much still. Just very carefully run along the base of them, and that's just going to get a little bit of contrast going in those armor panels, and you're going to make it be able to see your eye pick those details out even more. I apparently got some little bit of foam stuck to the miniature. Oops. And there's a bristle too. Let's see if I put it like this. Let's see how well. There's 4 little armor panels things sticking up right there. So I just very carefully add small amounts of this shade. I wonder if on the video they're going to start to stand out a lot more. Because I can see them reasonably well right now. But I bet just because nature of how these not super awesome cameras that I'm running, they're probably hard to see in the bright lights on the camera. And I bet if I start adding a little bit, yeah, I bet you can start seeing that a little bit better. Just a little bit of the shade, you're going to start seeing them jump out at you. And that's really what you're doing this for. This is all about just making it so your eye can pick out those details just a little bit better. And doing so, that just looks cooler. And it's also a great way if you screw up detail. Like if you accidentally paint in some things a little bit too much, you can use this method to kind of trick the eye to bringing that detail back out. Let me slide these guys back around. Yeah, you can probably see a little bit more of this, some little armor panels there. I don't know if it's a huge amount, but it's definitely much more noticeable now. Right along here, there's some raised armor panels. I put a little bit there. Same spot over here. That'll help you see those armor panels a little bit better. Along the guns, you can put a small amount along the guns. Each of the guns kind of has a little pyramid-like section sticking out the top. You can run just small amounts of this shade along the base of those pyramid sections and cause them to stand out a little bit more. And that's one of the ways, as we wrap up tonight, because it's been about an hour. I rambled on a lot talking about that retcon stuff. But you know, it's been about an hour, so I'm thinking, well, let's go ahead and probably call it a night. This is one of the ways you can use very small amounts of shade to just enhance the detail in your miniatures. If you do it too much, you know, it doesn't necessarily look bad, but like I said, my goal here was to paint up a miniature that looks really good under macro photography, and lots of shade under macro photography doesn't look very good. It's not so bad for tabletop standard, it looks plenty good, but you know, when you're trying to zoom in super close on a miniature, not so much. But using very small amounts like this can help bring out that detail without ruining the overall appearance of the miniature. And this little frigate is honestly tough to paint up to a really high quality photography standard. If I ever figure it out, I'll let you know. I'm just trying. The Shurikar Destroyer was pretty easy. The Pale Fox wasn't too bad. That one painted up pretty well. Prona wasn't too bad either. But I've just never had really good luck with these. Because there's lots of small cooling vents. And that's what I'm going to do next time probably, is deal with the cooling vents. Because I've got a... the challenge I ran into with the Pale Fox and its cooling vents is the Dawnstone Gray. It's a Citadel paint color that I use as the base color for all the silver things. Seem to have very, quote, coarse pigment. Coarse meaning a very relative word. It's not that coarse. But when you're doing macro photography, it is. So I bought some Lemaine Medium. Is that what it's called? It's Citadel paints. It's basically the liquid part of the paint is not the pigmented color. I think that's what it is. And I'm going to try to mix that in with the Dawnstone Gray, and maybe that will thin down the pigment a little bit and give it a nice smooth base color. Because what would happen is the Dawnstone Gray would just be bumpy enough that when I applied the brighter silvers, it really picked out the bumpiness, and it just didn't look all that good under a macro lens because it wasn't smooth. All right, this back area here, I'll deal with this. That's all cooling vents. I'll deal with that shading later. But there you go. That's the basic gist of how you highlight some of the areas and then use the shade to bring out some more details. All right, well, let's go ahead and call this episode done. Let's slide that back and let's jump on the stool. I've actually got two stools here in my recording studio. I found in order to get a nice good frame shot for the main camera, I sit on a stool, on a wood stool that's maybe about 6 inches taller than the little black stool I sit on for doing the painting. It actually works really well this way. I can just jump back and forth between the two. So anyway, random little fun production note there, because you actually can't see that stuff on camera. All the little hacks and tweaks, and I don't have my Kalidasia Live banner up. I forgot I had to pull it down because I was working on a different Kalidasia, or not a non-Kalidasia Twitch live stream. Come on, there we go. All right, finally that shows up. Now this late. Anyway, once again, I'm Jason. Thank you for watching this live stream here on Twitch.tv. To learn more about the Kalidasia universe, you can head over to that URL, and that's now at the bottom of your screen there, kalidasia.com/live, where you can find links to purchase the miniatures I painted out today, which of course is this Heragul Hammerhead frigate. And in a few weeks, you'll be able to get the various pieces to upgrade your Lynx battlecruiser to the new, much cooler command deck and all those fun things, and the really cool looking fire rail weapons, which we learned the history of those today on this live stream. So of course, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them on the YouTube video, because I'm assuming that's where you're watching this later on. And of course, you're always welcome to join me Thursday, 8 p.m. at Eastern Time, which right now is UTC -4 for the summer for daylight saving time. And you'll be able to join me at that point to go ahead and jump in the chat room here, ask me questions, feel free to ask away. And of course, you can always ask questions later on in the YouTube comments, and I can answer those on a future painting video. So with that, once again, I'm Jason. Thank you for watching, and have a good night.